If there's one thing history has taught us, it's this: mountains don't just shape the land, they shape the people. Isolated, wild, and fiercely unforgiving, the Appalachian Mountains have long been home to families who lived and sometimes died by their own code. We've all heard of some notorious families in American history, but none of them quite match the scary legacy of these deadly Appalachian families. These aren't just old ghost stories whispered around campfires. These families were real, their violence was real, and the fear they left behind still lingers in the hollers and hills. Starting from twisted blood feuds to outlaw kingdoms that defied the government for decades, these are the stories that never made it into the history books, but they shaped the culture and fear of entire regions. So, stay with us as we dig deep into the 10 deadliest families to ever walk the Appalachian Mountains. You won't believe how far some of them went to protect their name or destroy their enemies. Stick around, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're into the dark corners of American history. This is one ride you'll want to stay on. The Harpe brothers, America's first serial killers. Before the world got to know of criminal profilers, manhunts, or even a proper understanding of what serial killing meant, the Appalachian Mountains introduced us to the Harpe brothers, Micajah and Wiley. But brothers might not even be the right word. Some say they were cousins, others half-brothers. What's certain is this: together they carved a bloody path through Appalachia in the late 1700s that still haunts the region. Born in North Carolina, the Harpes emerged during the chaos of the Revolutionary War. They fought with the British, but when the war ended, they didn't go home. Instead, they disappeared into the hills and returned as something much worse. Moving through Tennessee and Kentucky, they left behind a trail of mutilated bodies, men, women, even children. They weren't outlaws in the traditional sense. They didn't rob for gain, they killed for the mere fun of it. Their most infamous act was the murder of a baby. But what was the reason for this action? They said the baby was crying too loud, and because of that, they slaughtered their own child. Even by the brutal standards of the frontier, that was too much. But the good thing here is that a posse eventually caught Big Harpe and cut off his head, displaying it on a spike. Little Harpe managed to escape for a time, joining a river pirate gang before meeting a similar end. The Harpes weren't a feud. They weren't a gang. They were a force of chaos, pure, directionless violence, given human form. And to this day, locals in parts of Kentucky still whisper about cursed trails where the Harpes once roamed. The French-Eversole feud, when politics turned to war. Among the most disturbing and violent family feuds to come out of the Appalachian region, the conflict between the French and Eversole families stands out, not just for its brutality, but for its roots in political power. Unlike the infamous Harpe brothers, whose terror stemmed from pure outlaw violence, the French-Eversole feud began in the smoke-filled backrooms of Kentucky politics. In the late 19th century, John G. French, a wealthy and influential landowner, found himself at odds with Joseph C. Eversole, a respected lawyer and state representative. Both men held considerable sway in Hazard, Kentucky, and at first their families were aligned, linked by shared business interests and local governance. But in the Appalachian Mountains, alliances were as fragile as the peace that held them together. The feud increased when accusations of corruption, vote buying, and betrayal began to swirl. And just like that, what started as a political maneuvering quickly descended into bloodshed. From 1885 to 1894, the hills of Perry County became a battleground. Ambushes were set for people, assassinations, and violent reprisals claimed dozens of lives. Ordinary life ground to a halt, schools were shuttered, businesses closed, and families fled to escape the chaos. The most upsetting moment came in 1888 when Joseph Eversole and his father were assassinated in broad daylight on the streets of Hazard. Despite numerous witnesses, no one dared speak. The silence wasn't a sign of loyalty, it was a symbol of fear. In this climate, speaking the truth could mean signing your own death warrant. This wasn't just a personal grudge, it was a war for control over the region's wealth, timber rights, coal lands, and political dominance. Each side built private armies. Elections were won not with votes, but with bullets. Justice finally arrived when Benjamin Fulton, a close associate of French, was convicted and hanged for Eversole's murder. It marked the first public execution in the area in years, signaling the beginning of the end. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The community was broken, trust between neighbors dissolved, and generations later, some descendants of the feud still refused to utter the opposing family's name. This wasn't a Hatfield-McCoy spat. This was political warfare, Appalachian style, where campaigns ended in coffins and ballots were backed by gunpowder. Now, if the French-Eversole feud showed what happened when politics turned violent, the next story cuts even deeper. So don't go anywhere. The Green-Jones feud, a family betrayal that lasted generations. West Virginia is full of family names that are etched into the hills like gravestones, but only a few carry the weight of Green or Jones, two Appalachian clans whose story begins not with a murder, but with a betrayal between blood. In the 1870s, the Greens and Joneses weren't enemies. They were family members that were connected by marriage, land deals, and shared faith. They logged timber side by side, broke bread at church dinners, and raised their children within shouting distance of each other's porches. But that peace shattered with a disputed land survey that redrew the boundary between their properties. The Greens accused the Joneses of forging the documents. The Joneses swore the Greens were trying to steal their land. You see, in the mountains, land means legacy, and those claims were like throwing a match into dry brush. What followed was not a single act of violence, but a slow-burning war that was passed down through generations. The first blow came during a nighttime ambush. Two Jones brothers were held at gunpoint while fishing in a quiet stream. In response, the Joneses struck back, and soon after, a Green family barn went up in flames with a child trapped inside. But the strange thing here is that each side denied responsibility. And yet, each side swore revenge. By the early 1900s, the law had given up. Investigators stopped asking questions. The locals lived by a code: don't see, don't speak. Funerals turned into firefights. In 1913, a Green cousin was shot and killed during a burial, just steps from the open grave. The most haunting part here is that the feud didn't burn out until the 1950s, when the last living heir to the original land dispute fled the state entirely. He changed his name, moved out west, and never looked back. Locals say he never spoke of West Virginia again. Appalachia is no stranger to family feuds, but the Green-Jones conflict wasn't about politics or business. It was personal, intimate, a family tree turned weapon, with roots poisoned by mistrust and memory. The Marcums and Philpots, when justice meant a loaded rifle. At number 7 is the story of Marcum and Philpot, two family names that are still spoken in whispers and remembered in the courtrooms of Clay County, Kentucky. Their feud didn't begin with a brawl in the Backwoods. It began in a courtroom with a verdict that didn't sit right. In the 1890s, John Philpot lost a land dispute to James Marcum. That alone might have sparked bitterness, but weeks later, Philpot's youngest son was found dead near Marcum's property, and that lit the match. The Philpots were convinced the Marcums had orchestrated the killing as a message. The Marcums denied it, blaming bandits. But in Clay County, the truth mattered less than the suspicion, and suspicion soon turned to blood. What happened after that was a string of retaliatory killings that turned public spaces into battlegrounds, courtrooms, taverns, churchyards. Nowhere was safe. In 1897, a Philpot cousin shot James Marcum in broad daylight on the courthouse steps. Just 2 days later, the shooter was found hanging from a tree. No trial, no witnesses, no justice. From then on, going to the law was just background noise. Families carried rifles to weddings and funerals. Preachers gave sermons in fear. Even attempts at peace dissolved in violence. One so-called treaty meeting at a general store ended in gunfire, 3 men dead, including 2 bystanders with no connection to either family. By the early 1900s, federal marshals tried to step in, but Clay County had closed ranks. One federal agent wrote, "They speak English in those hills, but they might as well be from another country." The Marcum-Philpot feud wasn't about money, land, or moonshine. It was about something far more dangerous: wounded pride. And in the mountains of Kentucky, pride doesn't die with a signature, it dies with a bullet. But none of that is compared to the Smoot family. Keep watching because it gets more interesting from here. The Smoot family, a self-made militia in the North Carolina hills. Hidden deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Smoot family wasn't just another backwoods clan. They were their own law, their own army, and some would say their own nation. The Smoots settled near Avery County, North Carolina in the mid-1800s, carving out land so remote it didn't appear on most maps. But isolation didn't mean peace. When the Civil War broke out, the Smoots refused to fight for either side. Instead, they formed their own militia to protect their land and kept it going long after the war ended. By the 1880s, the Smoots were known for violently defending their territory. Trespassers didn't get warnings, they disappeared. The family built lookout towers, even trained hunting dogs, and patrolled their woods with military precision. Locals said they operated like a fortress. Their most notorious act came in 1894 when a group of revenue agents tried to shut down Smoot Still. Only one agent made it back alive, and he refused to speak of what he saw. Rumors spread that the Smoots held military drills in secret clearings and stockpiled weapons like a private army. Strangers were never welcome. A traveling preacher once wandered onto Smoot land and was found days later, shoeless and raving, unable to explain what happened. In time, modernization crept in. The younger generation left for work or war. But to this day, hikers in the region report hearing strange chants and spotting old warning signs carved into trees. Smoot land, turn back. The Sizemores, loyalty, vengeance, and the blood code. On the Virginia-Kentucky border, the name Sizemore means one thing: loyalty, no matter the cost. For over a century, the Sizemore clan was both feared and respected, depending on which side of the rifle you stood. The Sizemores were known as enforcers of their own brand of justice. If you harmed one, you harmed all. That wasn't just a saying, it was a blood code. In the early 1900s, when a distant cousin was shot in a poker dispute, 4 Sizemores rode through 3 counties to execute the killer, dragging him out of a sheriff's jail at gunpoint. This wasn't vigilantism, it was clan rule. They mediated local disputes, controlled access to forest lands, and ran moonshine networks in a way that was so efficient that federal agents often just left them alone. One prohibition agent noted, "Going after the Sizemores is like punching a hornet's nest with no backup." They weren't cruel without cause. Outsiders who showed respect were often welcomed. But when it came to betrayal, they treated that one differently. In 1938, a cousin who testified against another Sizemore vanished days before trial. The only clue was a bloodied shoe found beside a mountain spring. Even into the 1960s, their influence remained. Police cars rarely entered Sizemore territory without backup. Schools taught local history, but skipped their name entirely. The Sizemores weren't just another feuding family. They were an institution, living proof that in some Appalachian hollows, the law came second to family. And it did not end there. The Hannon family, blood, coal, and the devil's backbone. Tennessee, Orange, Kentucky border. At number 4 is the story of the Hannons, a family tied so deep into the shadows of East Kentucky that even mentioning their name was considered bad luck. Folks say if you heard the sound of chains in the trees near Bear Creek Hollow, you were already too close to their land and too far from help. But the thing here is that the Hannons weren't always feared. Back in the 1800s, they were just another mountain family trying to survive. But after the Civil War, something changed. One brother came back from the battlefield. Different. Some say he saw too much. Others say he brought something back with him, something dark. After that, the family closed in on itself, becoming reclusive and strange. They stopped going to church. They didn't trade in town. And then folks started disappearing. At first, it was just a traveler here, a surveyor there. But by the early 1900s, people were whispering about Hannon justice. If someone trespassed or even argued with one of them, they might never come home. The law tried to step in once, in 1911. A deputy led a small posse into the hollow, and none of them came back. Their horses returned days later, bleeding and riderless. After that, no one tried again. The strangest part is that no one ever found a Hannon in the county records. No birth certificates, no land deeds. Just a cabin buried in vines, a barn full of rusted tools, and rumors passed from front porch to front porch. Old-timers still talk about the woman in white, seen standing at the edge of the tree line, watching silently. Some believe she's a Hannon widow. Others say she's not human at all. But either way, the message is the same. Don't go wandering in Bear Creek Hollow after dark. By the 1970s, the last known Hannon cabin burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Locals saw the fire, but no one called for help. That was the unspoken rule. You leave the Hannons alone, even in death, because some families are buried by time. Others are buried on purpose. The Toll family of eastern Kentucky, moonshine, and mountain justice. But unlike the Claytons, not every Appalachian family built their name on revenge or old grudges. Some, like the Tolls, were feared for something else, protecting their land, their liquor, and their own version of the law. In the deep woods of eastern Kentucky, far from any map, the Toll family ran a moonshine empire that stretched across 5 counties. At the center of it all was Delia Toll, a one-eyed widow known for shooting a sheriff just for stepping on her squash. The Tolls didn't just make liquor, they made the rules. Their stills were hidden in mountain hollows, guarded by dogs, tripwires, and old men who remembered every face. But the liquor wasn't what made them legends. It was their code. Hurt a child, steal from a neighbor, or disrespect an elder, and you didn't deal with the law, you dealt with the Tolls. One man, accused of beating his wife, was found hanging upside down from a tree with his hands soaked in moonshine. Another, caught robbing cabins, was tied to a post at the county line with a sign that read, "Thieves walk from here." Even the police stayed away. Local sheriffs were known to skip Tolle land during raids. Some folks say the Tolls had secrets on everyone, letters, files, photos. Others say it was simpler than that. The Tolls did the hard things the law wouldn't. By the 1970s, federal agents started cracking down on moonshiners. In 1978, their biggest still was destroyed in a raid. Delia, 83 years old, stood on her porch with a shotgun, daring anyone to step on her land. She was arrested but never charged. These days, people don't say much about the Tolls, but in old bars and barbershops, someone might lean in and say, they kept the peace, mountain style, not clean, not pretty, but fair. And around here, that was often enough. The Logan Wildcats, coal, control, and the men who took the mountain. Not every Appalachian legend begins with blood feuds or moonshine. Some were built with rifles, payoffs, and raw power. In the coal-rich hills of southern West Virginia, the name that once made Union men think twice wasn't a family, it was a force, the Logan Wildcats. They weren't outlaws in the usual sense. The Wildcats were a group of hand-picked men, tough, loyal, and armed to the teeth, led by Sheriff Don Chafin in the 1920s. Backed by powerful coal companies, they were paid to keep Union organizers out and company profits safe. And they didn't do it with words. They did it with gunfire. If a miner whispered about joining the Union, the Wildcats might show up that night. If an organizer passed through Logan County, he might be followed, harassed, or worse, disappear entirely. They operated like a private army, setting up roadblocks, patrolling the hills, and watching every hollow. Locals said you didn't see the Wildcats. You felt them. And if you were smart, you kept your head down. Their most infamous moment came in 1921 at the Battle of Blair Mountain, the largest armed labor uprising in U.S. history. Over 10,000 coal miners marched to demand better pay and conditions. The Wildcats dug trenches, manned machine guns, and held the line for the coal barons. For nearly a week, those mountains turned into a war zone. Bullets flew, planes dropped tear gas. And when it was over, the miners surrendered. But the memory never faded. The Logan Wildcats weren't born from backwoods legend. They were hired muscle dressed in lawman's clothes. No ghosts, no curses, just cold ambition and a paycheck. They didn't protect the people. They protected the money. And for a time, they ruled the southern hills with iron fists and loaded guns. Even today, some folks say Logan County still remembers. Not in stories told around a fire, but in silence. Because the Wildcats may be gone, but the fear they planted runs deep in the coal dust. But here comes the deal breaker. Don't go anywhere. The Melungeons, Shadows of the Ridge. At number 1 is a name that isn't tied to one single family, but to a whole group of them. A name whispered across Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky for generations. The Melungeons. They weren't moonshiners or feuding clans, not in the way the others were. The Melungeons were something different, something people didn't quite understand, and that made them feared. Descended from a mysterious mix of European, African, and Native American ancestry, the Melungeons settled in the remote ridges of Appalachia in the 1700s. And from the beginning, they didn't fit anywhere. They spoke strange dialects, kept to themselves, and married within their own. Outsiders said their skin was too dark, their customs too foreign. Rumors flew. Were they Turkish, Portuguese, Moorish? No one really knew, and the Melungeons weren't telling. That secrecy made people suspicious. In the mountains, suspicion can be deadly. By the 1800s, the Melungeons were targets. Land stolen, rights denied, children barred from schools. In some counties, they weren't allowed to testify in court or vote, but instead of leaving, they built hidden communities in the hills, tight, closed, and fiercely protective. There are stories, of course, about travelers who disappeared near Melungeon land, about strangers who were warned once and never returned. Nothing confirmed, nothing written down, just front porch whispers about roads you shouldn't take after dark. Some say the Melungeons practiced old mountain magic. Others say they just knew how to survive when the law forgot them. But one thing's certain, they kept to their own, and they remembered who crossed them. Even today, you can find old cemeteries with no names, just stones turned backward, homes tucked deep off gravel roads. And every now and then, someone will say, that family's part Melungeon, and leave it at that. Because around here, that still means something. The Melungeons weren't just victims, they were survivors. And in a region where names carry power, theirs still echoes, wrapped in silence, survival, and just enough fear to make you wonder what really happened in those hills. So it's clear that these Appalachian families weren't just families. They were empires, built on loyalty, silence, and blood. In the mountains, justice didn't always come from the law. It came from last names. And some of those names still echo through the trees today. Which family gave you chills? Tell us in the comments. And if you've heard other stories, let us also know. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.